Today we're going to learn about 3 different types of pinch pots. But before we can begin with our pinch pots, first we need to have roughly a pound of clay. A pound of clay kind of looks about like the size of a softball. If it's a little bit more, that's okay. And if it's a little bit less, that's okay. Before we can begin our pinch pots, we need to make sure that we work up our clay by wedging it. Wedging helps to remove the air pockets so we don't have explosions. So you can see there's a hole here, that's an air pocket. And then wedging also allows to make the clay workable. So if it was too soft, I could wedge the moisture out. And if it was too dry, I could add water to the clay. So I'm going to go ahead and push down onto the table. And I'm going to squeeze in as I'm doing that. Now, technically, I prefer to stand when I'm wedging, but for this demonstration video, I think you'll get the idea with me sitting. So you want to make sure that you squeeze your sides, push down, pull onto the top, squish down, and you continue to do this process for a minute or so, or until you feel that the clay is in a good workable condition. So once you've finished wedging, to make our 3 pinch pots, we're going to take this hunk of clay and divide it into 3 pieces. So I'm just going to kind of rip my clay, so nothing fancy, just kind of pulled it. And then I'm going to look at the 3 different sizes. So this one here looks a little bit bigger than my other 2. So I'm going to take just a little bit of clay and get it to this one. And then I'm going to take a little bit more clay and put it onto this one. And now I feel that they're pretty similar in size. From there, I'm going to go ahead and take that ball of clay and I'm going to roll it into a more rounded ball. So I can use my hands, kind of squish and roll. I can use the table. So whatever feels comfortable to you. It doesn't have to be perfectly round, but as round as you can get this hunk of clay would be the best. So you can see I went from kind of this to this. And so I'm going to continue to do that with my other 2 hunks of clay. So I like to use kind of the table, and I also like to use the combination of my hands as well. So you just kind of need to figure out what's going to work best for you, and really don't stress. We're just making a roundish piece of clay. And so I'm going to take my last ball of clay and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to roll it in my hands, and then I'm going to roll it on my table space, kind of squish it back in my hand. It was getting a little bit too oval shaped. And now I have a round form. So many of you have created pinch pots before, but this time we're going to be making 3 specific pinch pots. The first one is what's called the deep pinch pot. And this one's tall. So you can see that it looks almost like a V shape, and it has a very small bottom. So we're not just going to stick our fingers into the clay and pinch. We have to pinch a certain way to direct the form to create a deep pinch pot. So I'm going to take one of my balls of clay, set my other ones aside, and I'm going to hold it in my non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, and so I'm going to hold it in my left hand. I'm going to take the point of my thumb and I'm going to push that into the middle of the clay ball. So you can see I've created a hole. I tried to get that hole as even into the middle as I possibly could. That's going to really help me out later on. So if I really squished over to the side, I probably want to re-roll my ball and try it again. So now that I have the opening, I'm going to flip my pinch pot onto my thumb. And in order to make this pot nice and tall, I'm going to gently, but still kind of firm. It can't be too hard and it can't be too soft. But what I'm doing is making that clay elongate over the top of my thumb. If I don't put any pressure, nothing will happen. If I put too much pressure, I'll really deform what I've started. So right now, I kind of look like I have a mushroom top on the top of my thumb. So I want to take my thumb out. And so this is the start of my deep pinch pot. But it's really still too thick. So this is where we actually start pinching the pot. I'm going to put my thumb and my index finger into the pot, and I'm gently going to start pinching between my thumb and my finger. And so I'm starting at the bottom, and I'm working my way upward. Then I'm going to rotate. I'm going to start at the bottom and work upward. I have to apply some pressure, but I definitely don't want to squish and squeeze this too hard. If I do that, that's going to deform the pot to where I can't really change it. Now, I'm not worried. My top is not level. I can take care of that later when the clay is stronger. Only thing I want to do right now is to pinch it even in thickness. And I can switch hands if it's more comfortable. I don't want to have one area too thick. If you have an area too thick, you risk an air pocket. Even if you wedged your clay, it's still possible to trap air into thick areas. So I'm just going to gently continue to pinch around and around my pinch pot so that I can get the thickness a little bit more even. And again, I'm pinching the clay. I'm not squishing it necessarily together, but more like pinching, gentle pinches. You have to pinch it hard enough that you can have something move or happen, but you don't want to pinch it too hard so that you really make an indentation or something difficult. So now I've thinned out the pot. It's not as pointy as my image, but it's still pretty close to being the same thing by having that nice tall look to it. And I can set it onto the table simply by pushing my finger into the bottom so that it stands upright. So if I tilt it backward, you can see it has a small bottom. It's not super fat. Now my pot is a little bit rounded, maybe not as V-shaped as my picture, but that's a good start for the deep pot. And I'm just going to set that one aside for right now, making sure it stands up. So the next pinch pot we're going to create is called the shallow pot. This pot is short, and it has a very small bottom. So where the tall pinch pot or deep pinch pot had some height to it, this one we want to make sure stays close to the table. However, we don't want a flat bottom. This has a point, so that point needs to be there. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a short, flat plate. This is not a plate. So of my 2 balls of clay that I have remaining, I want to see if there's one that's smaller. If not, just go ahead and pick one. But sometimes they're just a little bit off in size, and so if one is smaller, use that one. So for the shallow pot, I'm still going to hold it in my non-dominant hand. So again, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to hold it in my left. And this time, I'm using the fat part of my thumb. And then I'm going to go ahead and press that clay pretty far down in. So if I take my thumb out, you can see the middle. Okay, so I made that opening. So now from this position, I'm going to hold it in my hand, and I'm going to take my thumb and push down. Be firm, but gentle. I know those are words that don't seem like they should go together, but you have to give the clay a little bit of work, and then you also can't work it too hard. So right now, this is my shallow pinch pot. It kind of looks like a flower. So I'm going to flip it upside down, and I'm going to start to pinch outward. I want this pinch pot to flare. So I don't want a flat bottom. I want it to come to a point, and I want it to have a nice flare. So I'm just going to keep pinching outward between my thumb and my fingers. Again, if you want to switch hands, you can. I kind of go back and forth between my right hand and my left hand. But if I look at my pinch pot, you can hopefully see that it's starting to have some type of flare. Now there's a lot of fingerprints. I also don't want to make it flat onto the table. I want to make sure that it just has a small point to the bottom. Now the shallow pot, because we're using soft, wet clay, is going to take some time before you really see that it's shallow. We're going to trim this top off, so that way it's not so high to the table. Just like with my deep pot, I said I'm not worried about this area where it's high, because as long as my shallow pot is shorter than the deep pot, I've done what I've needed to do. If you flip it upside down and push it kind of around your finger, you can give it a little bit more of a flare downward. Now, to many of you, this pot right now is going to look like, not so good. But that's where the next step comes in, where we start to refine and make things smooth and even. So the last pinch pot that we're going to create is what's called the semicircular. The semicircular is very round, and it's the only pinch pot we've made today that has a very large bottom. So it's nice and fat, and that's how we get that roundness, or semicircular, because it doesn't go all the way around. So I'm going to take my last ball of clay that I have. I'm going to hold it in my hand like the other ones. I'm going to hold it, take my thumb, the point again, not the fat part, but the point, find the middle, and push in. So very similar to earlier. I want to make sure I get my thumb out. So you can see that the hole, and when I kind of push down in, I want to see if I can feel, because I don't want to go through the bottom. So in order to get this pinch pot nice and round and fat, I need to start pushing. And I'm not doing any pinching yet. I'm just pushing my thumb on the inside towards the outside part. And I know that's a little tricky for you to see, but I'm just pushing it out. And at first, not a whole lot's going to happen to my pot, except it's getting a little bit more rounded. So now I'm going to start that pinching. I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to start pinching upward. This is to help thin out our clay. Again, we want our thicknesses to be as even as possible. If your clay is too thick, you risk an explosion in the kiln. You also risk having it take a very long time to dry, and then sort of running out of options for moving forward. So we want to get that thickness nice and even. And again, I'll switch hands sometimes. So if my one hand gets tired, even though I started it in that hand, I'm going to switch. And then sometimes I'll switch back. So in order to make this the incredibly round or semicircular pot, I'm going to go ahead and kind of roll the top in. And so at first you can't really see what I'm doing, but I'm kind of just like pushing and pulling that top inward. So if you think of this one kind of like the bottom of a pumpkin, or anything that will roll inward. So see how that lip kind of comes in? Hopefully you can see a little bit in here how it comes in. And then you can also see that it's very round. This one you can have set on the table. Now I want to go back through and double check my thickness. I just want to make sure that I have everything nice and thin or even. And I can do this with all three of my pinch pots. This also helps get rid of fingerprints, and I'm just doing very gentle pinches now. So today, we've created our semicircular pinch pot. I know our shallow pinch pot doesn't look like much yet, but it will. Eventually, we just have this nice small bottom, and we'll be able to level it out and make it more shallow. And then we have our deep pinch pot. So our goal with making these three different pinch pots is to get the basic forms, so that one is tall, one is short, and one is very round. That shows me that you can manipulate the clay in these different manners. Our next steps will be trying to refine them. So what you need to do to finish your pinch pots today is to put them onto a board or simply just into a bag. So I'm just going to grab a bag. I don't have a board with me today, which is just fine. Some of you might and some of you might not. I want to make sure that I put the pinch pot into the bag. And then I carefully either want to close the bag. This one has a Ziploc where I can Ziploc it, or I want to make sure that it's tucked under. These pots need to dry a little bit so they become what's called leather hard. At leather hard, we're going to be able to refine our clay and make it look a lot better. So don't stress if your pinch pots aren't perfect.